Before we jump into John's podcast, if you've ever felt like you should be reading more or thinking more deeply about the world, but didn't know where to start or who to do it with, we just launched something for you. It's an online book club and community with Dr. John Patrick. Starting this February, we'll go through important books together, guided by Dr. John, with live discussions and a thoughtful group of people who want to grow in wisdom, clarity, and critical thinking. It's free to join right now, but we may introduce paid access later. A benefit, if you do join now, you'll get exclusive early access to a live Q&A with Dr. Patrick. So if that sounds like something that you want to be a part of, don't wait. Just click the link in the description or show notes to join, and we'll see you inside.
I've always been fascinated by how accidental, in inverted commas, things can grow into something so satisfying. And people who want to reduce education to a set of outcomes that you have to tick off and then you're educated, it doesn't work that way. There are skills you need for the outcomes you want, but the Faculty of Education doesn't seem to understand that. But I said, an example of what I mean, I was walking into St. Thomas's Hospital, or a long while ago, in the 1970s, probably. May even been earlier than that. Yeah. And as I came in, I passed the elevator going up to the intensive care unit, and out stepped a good friend who said, "Oh, hello, John. I've got a patient just arrived that might interest you. She's got a very high serum sodium." I said, "How high?" And he said, 150. What's the disease? She's got acute onset diabetes. I just went back to biochemistry to check the number before I did anything. I said, "Well, I'm glad you did that. Can I get a blood sample and give me 5 minutes before you start doing anything?" So I got a blood sample. I went to my own lab. And within 2 or 3 minutes, I called Steve back and said, "She's not really hypernatremic. She's actually got a low sodium, because when you spin her blood down, it is full of fat. It's white. The plasma is white. And if you measure the osmolality, you can work out just how much solid there is in her plasma sample." Now, when we talk about, you hear it on television, in films, everywhere. They'll give sodium, potassium, whatever, and they just give the number. What's the sodium? 150, 120, whatever the number is. And you never stop unless you've got this curiosity thing there to say, what's going on? Because we're making an approximation every time we do that. What the cell sees is the concentration of sodium in the water in the plasma, but there's always a few percent solid, but it's pretty constant. So the number we get out of the machine is not true in terms of being what the cell sees, but it's true in the sense of being usable safely and appropriately. It's just set off. But every now and again, and this would be one of the most dramatic examples you would see, you can get a lot of solid in your blood, and then you have to adjust for it. So what this lady actually needed was to get more water into her body to lower that, get it the right way around. That soda was not that high, so she didn't need a lot of water. She actually needed ordinary saline treatments because she was an ordinary patient as far as the cell was concerned. And if you went the other way, you would make things worse. Obviously, once we got the numbers right, the treatment was fine and she recovered quite nicely. But if I hadn't had no, that can't be possible. That's outside the range of what I know is possible. So it's got to be some sort of artifact. And I'd come across this phenomenon in other settings. An interest in body composition leads you to all sorts of ways of realizing we're often taking intellectual shortcuts, which are a bit lazy. Another example would be in the Second World War, football players were getting dismissed from being enrolled because they were overweight. And overweight was obesity. But of course, in football players, it wasn't obesity, it was muscle. But you had to prove that. The only way you could do it is by weighing them underwater, and that's what they did. And that was an interesting step forward in people recognizing the importance of thinking about body composition rather more carefully. So all these things, little things that everybody else would miss, or almost everybody else. Fortunately for whoever's involved, somebody says, oh, let's just think about that. Faraday's famous, which I've mentioned on this podcast before, seeing that a wire vibrated when you passed electricity through a wire in a magnetic field. Nobody else saw the vibration because their minds were set up in other categories. All their mathematics was straight line, and what was happening here was different. And of course, at the end of the day, when he first noticed this, he'd built a little electric motor in one day just by seeing that the wire was trying to move. So those kinds of anecdotal things are what people react to beautifully. Good sermons usually need a hook of some sort. Good lectures. I mean, the modern student is so bored stiff and they think everything can be got from AI or whatever that you've got to get under their skin. And a narrative can do that. The same can happen with sermons if they're good. We're not trying in lectures really to give a really organized account of a subject. If we do that, that's worth doing, but that's a special case because you're incredibly talented. But for the ordinary guy like me, you've got to get the kids' interests so that they then go off and start exploring things for themselves with a greater sense of excitement rather than the boredom of saying, oh, what have I got to remember for this test? Our education system is out of control. And that's what I want to talk about today, really, is because I do it regularly every now and again, but this one will probably be slightly different. So stories like that, especially for younger people, help them to understand. I've been watching over the last few months because there's been a whole series of Second World War things which interest me, including ones about people who made key observations and then broke the bureaucratic structure at the risk of court-martial, having tried it out secretly. And of course, at wartime, at least if you could then show, look, this is what I've done. I know I shouldn't have done it without it going through the appropriate levels of bureaucracy. But this is important. The one that I got to this week was a lovely account of a modification to the Spitfire, because when a new German fighter came along, it couldn't turn as tightly as the Messerschmitt could. And a guy nearly lost his life because of that. And he got back, he said to the mechanic, who was a very good guy, he said, it just feels heavier than it needs to be. Can you find a way to give me a tighter turn and less effort so that we can be more mobile in the air? And the guy thought about it. And he said, well, I'll look. And all he came up in the end, he was obviously way beyond the ordinary mechanic. He could do the mathematics. And all that was needed, well, say all, was to change the size of the spools on the routing route from the lever to the aileron. And that dramatically changed the tightness of the turn, so the Spitfire could turn and come up behind the tail of the Messerschmitt, and bang, the Messerschmitt was gone. Now, they did that, and he flew it and said, this is wonderful. Then he tried it in battle, and he shot down 2 or 3 Messerschmitts, which was more than they'd done in weeks. They'd been having to defend themselves rather than attack. It's a lovely story. A tiny thing, huge, huge impact. And there are many examples. So that's exciting, isn't it? Everybody likes narrative of that sort. And that's why I'm so concerned that we talk about what matters most to our lives much more, rather than ticking off a list of what the child has to do. I mean, what you're interested in is what's happening to the child's mind. I love watching my grandchildren a little while back, and now great-grandchildren. Kids, when they first come in, they're looking at the world, and they're so interesting. And you see their acquisition of vocabulary. But nowadays, we're not doing a good job in this area. During this week, my wife came across a study from England where they had taken a 1950s exam and given it to the people of the same age group who were given the best students in the class, by the way, and they were given some training at the level that education was happening then, and they took this exam. And the best students today couldn't pass the exam of the 1950s. That's not progress. This is what happens when you start getting your wires somewhat crossed. That happened to fit in with Helen Andrews, who I've been reading over the last few weeks and following what she's been doing. And her account of what's happening is worth knowing about. You can find her very easily if you're interested. Just go and listen to her quickly on YouTube before you decide what you want to do. And I would suggest you go to Unheard with Freddie Sayers interviewing Helen Andrews. Or if you're more familiar with them, the National got name block, so you have to use Freddie Sayers. The Conservative Review, she gave a lecture there which blew them away. But Freddie Sayers is a beautiful interviewer anyway, and it's a nice account of what's going on. And essentially, here's the bottom line, she defines wokeness as feminization, allowing female patterns of behavior to dominate where in the past male patterns of behavior dominated. And the question is this the cause of the clear failure in educational standards? She maintains that it is, because the wokeness basically inhibits vigorous debate. But vigorous debate is what you need. And one of the things we had to learn at school, we had to make our cases orally in front of our peers and take the flack that inevitably came. And that was good. It's important to learn how to have your view of the world taken apart. And instead of saying, I am offended, you're hurting my feelings, you say, can I defend this rationally? And if you can't, then you better think, am I wrong? Is this going to do me harm? And the answer is yes, it is. I think it's clear that this is the case now. We made the change in a very short period. Really, it was well underway by 2020. But it wasn't underway at the beginning of this century. So in less than a dozen years, really, we have changed the ethos of education completely. And now we're seeing results. Even IQ is dropping. I thought of IQ as being so basic that it was sort of going to be always valid. But apparently that's not so. Even IQ is dropping off. We haven't learned to think rationally. I remember taking it, and the IQ test was, as far as I was concerned, lots of little puzzles, and I loved little puzzles, so I loved IQ tests. I didn't think of them as being something to be afraid of. I looked forward to them. Fun. And that's what they should be. They shouldn't have emotional baggage, but of course they do because of what they're called. But even that is going down. And reading, way, way down. I mean, people are graduating high school in North America, and I suspect in Britain too, incapable of reading. Certainly, even university students can't read properly, in my view. I mean, I started reading in public in church when I was 10 or 11 or something like that. I mean, it was a little church and everybody knew me, so they liked the fact that I could read the scriptures. And we had a previous vicar, not the current one. His daughter read the lesson at about the same age, and she's the same sort of, smart little kid, and she read it beautifully. But most kids can't read at all because they read the words with absolutely the same emphasis on every word. The analogy I use to make the point is to say, we've all listened to a piece of music we like and started waving our hands in time with the music. But that's not conducting. What a conductor does is he knows that music. Absolutely. I mean, many of the great conductors don't even need the music in front of them. They know it. And they're not conducting in the sense of going along with the orchestra. They're wanting to pull a bit more out of those second violins or close those cellos down just a touch. So their mind is on what's coming next and what do I need to do to bring this to life even more. That's an entirely different way of thinking about music, isn't it? Not many of us could do anything approaching that, because even when we know the music, we wouldn't know how to bring the different bits of the orchestra together. It's not just notes on paper. Now, when I ask one has to be fairly careful about asking people to read in public, even at university level, because it's embarrassing to listen to some university students trying to read a text aloud because they simply haven't had to do it. Now, if I'm reading a passage of scripture that I know, I don't read the words. I know what the words are. I could probably recite it. It's nice to have the text there so I don't need it. But I'm looking at the whole structure of, a paragraph? And asking myself the question subliminally, how do I pause? Where do I pause? What do I want to have achieved with this sentence at the end of the sentence? Now, an example, very simple one that you can go pick up your Bible and see. It's probably safer to go back to King James if you've got lying around, because translators sometimes destroy these markers, but it's probably still findable in the RSV and a few others, but it's probably destroyed in some of the nearly infallible wooden versions that we have around. But in that first paragraph of Ephesians, if you were writing it in paragraphs, one phrase occurs 3 times, and it's the phrase "for the praise of his glory." So if you want to bring that text to life, you've got to make sure that they catch that. So it's got to receive some emphasis. God, before he made us, knew us for the praise of his glory. He arranged our lives so that we should live them for the praise of his glory. And we're going to spend eternity within all the wonder that involves. To miss that is very sad, because Paul structured it beautifully. So real reading does that. I mean, we all know this, don't we, at one level, if we only stop and think. Actors can say things that we've heard many times before, and they say them in such a way that, wow, magnificent. That's what makes a great actor. They can do that. They can imprint single lines on you. But we could all do a lot more in that direction. We would enjoy our reading more if we did that. So, taking note of things, being able to stop and say, I wonder why that happened. I've never seen that before. What's going on? That's the starting point for so many things. Once you get me started on this, which is my daughter's fault, for example, I'll try and stop after this one and get on with what I planned to say to you. But the first effective drug in the modern sense was foxglove leaf, dried and ground up. And the way it came about in the 18th century with, who was it now? A doctor from the University of Birmingham. I've got a name block for the moment. He'll come back in a minute. But anyway, he was interested in herbal treatments, as many people are now, but his was because he had nothing else. And so he was walking some distance from Birmingham in the Shrewsbury area, and he met a woman who was collecting herbs, who was a herbalist, if you like. And so they started talking about different plants. And there must have been foxgloves growing nearby. It's Wittering is the name of the doctor. And he said, do you have any use for the foxglove? And she says, no. It occasionally I use it when someone needs to vomit. It will make people vomit. But, and occasionally it doth cure the dropsy. Now, dropsy is swollen ankles. There are several causes of it, but the main one that she was talking about but didn't know it is heart failure, congestive heart failure. But Wittering was smart enough, said, that's interesting. So he went back to his lab with foxgloves, dried the leaves, and started playing with them. And that was the first drug that increased the force of contraction of the heart, and that got rid of the swelling. Amazing. One sentence, a throwaway line to somebody who was open to what it might mean, and we had the beginning of pharmacology. Amazing. Now, when I started medicine, that's how long ago it was, we were still using dried foxglove leaves for the digoxin effect. It wasn't digoxin then, digitalis we called it, because that's the name of foxglove in Latin. And it was awful because it wouldn't pass testing today because the range between therapy and problem is too small. But it was the only thing we had that worked. So we're constantly titrating. If you gave them a little bit too much, they started vomiting and not feeling well. If you reduced it too much, then they started swelling again. And there was that narrow window that you had to try and hit. And then Burroughs Wellcome, chemists established what the actual chemical was, and digoxin came on the market, and for most people, 2 pills a day at 0.25 milligrams, and it was done. Amazing. That's all happened in my lifetime. But a tiny observation that somebody who understood what it meant makes all the difference. Now, about half a dozen other examples are in my head now, and I must stop because you don't really want to hear me wittering on about these little stories, although they're fun to. And I'll use some more in the future if I get some response. But back to people I've been listening to. Helen Andrews and Dallas Willard have been main components of this week, both of whom have been extremely useful to me. And that goes along with a little dip into Tolkien when I was tired but couldn't go to sleep. So I'll start with the Tolkien. Because I know there'll be many of you out there who are Lord of the Rings fans, but who says in the Lord of the Rings that man often fails of his promise, but never of his seed? I used to think that was something that Tolkien had invented for himself, a rather nice aphorism. It occurs in the Lord of the Rings where Gimli and Legolas are talking about the hobbits, who are human, of course. And that's what they say. They're interesting creatures, aren't they? And, of course, Gimli and Legolas really loved Frodo's offspring, Frodo and his cousins who got caught by the orcs, and later there was a long chase. But that phrase, man often fails of his promise, but never of his seed, is so true. So many people have obvious talent, and then their lives get out of control and their talent never develops in the way that it should. But you'll see there's family traits in this respect too. The genes matter. But it wasn't Tolkien who invented the phrase. It's actually from a bishop in the 17th century. But Tolkien certainly made it known. And he, of course, was widely read. And it was an English bishop, I think from Norfolk, but that doesn't really matter. If you were fortunate enough to be in certain families in Cambridge in the 50s and 60s, you would see the working out of family potential big time, because the Huxleys and the Adrians and the Hodgkins were all at Cambridge. So you could be at Christmas dinner if you were in that group and you were a child, and there would be several Nobel Prize winners around the table. Don't you think that the conversation might start to set a standard at a very high level? I mean, there were two Huxleys, a biologist, Julian, and the physiologist, and then Dorothy Hodgkin won one of the first women to win a Nobel Prize. Her brother won one as well. Quite a family to have around the table. Genes matter, but they have to be properly trained and developed. Read the story of John Stuart Mill if you want to see an example of, I think, overdoing it. His father was making him learn Greek when he was about 5. Maybe his father was smarter than we realized. But those two things, natural talent and the environment, have to come together. Now, clearly that data on IQ and failing tests that people could pass in the 1950s shows that the education system has gone badly awry. And of course, Eleanor Andrews has pointed out that what she thinks is at stake here is psychology, really. And you hear all the psychologists talk about traits. Peterson does it all the while. But there are traits that are identifiable. It's not wrong to say that men and women are not only biologically distinct, they're behaviorally distinct as well. Easily shown by proper statistics, which the political elites usually know nothing about. The famous Peterson interview where, I've forgotten who she was now, but she deserved the takedown she got. She makes her living by making fools of highly intelligent but sometimes inarticulate men in public on television. And she foolishly took on Peterson, who took her down because she brought up the whole chestnut of women being paid less for the same jobs as men. And he said, "You do know about multivariate analysis?" Of course, she didn't. He said, if instead of just looking at that correlation, you actually add to the analysis hours expended and look at the dollars per hour expended, you find, lo and behold, men work harder than women by quite a lot. They do many more hours. Especially top-level men who are workaholics of the first order. 80 hours a week seems to them, at a very slack week. But women have many wider interests and responsibilities. But that has to be taken into account. So the arrival over the last, a dozen years or so, I mean, I'm used to it now, but what you have just said offends me. That is so ridiculous, with no mention of what it is. And so my response is always the same. Well, I did not set out with the intention of offending you, but now can we discuss whatever it was and find out whether what I said was true or false? End of argument. it is not acceptable to allow in an academic environment to propose the idea that if you make me feel bad, if you offend me, that is not acceptable. That is simply, well, it will destroy, it clearly is destroying, real academic intent. I mean, the three people who got everything absolutely right about how to manage COVID were cancelled instead of engaged with. If they'd engaged with them in a proper fashion, it would have been apparent very quickly they knew what they were talking about and they had the data to prove it, but they weren't even allowed to do that. At least one of them now, Jay Bhattacharya, is the head of NIH, and that's a reward. But he lost kilograms of weight over the vitriol that he got for not supporting masks and everything else, saying it's not the right way to go. You don't try and stop people spreading the disease to a vulnerable group. You hide the vulnerable group somewhere where they're not all together and sitting there like stuffed ducks waiting to be shot. So the right thing to have done would have been to say, if you love your grandma or whoever else is in an old people's home at the moment, take them back to be with you, give them their own room, and tell them to make sure nobody comes in that they don't know about, they don't want to see. They've got to isolate themselves till this is over. That's the right way to go. But no, we did it the other way. Only Sweden did it the right way. They have the best figures. So, Helen Andrews is, well, she was a lawyer, and as she says, she is a lawyer. She likes arguing, so she's not put out by the people that she's annoying with her view. You can imagine that wokeness is feminization is not a motto that would go very far. So wokeness is patterns of behavior which happens to correlate very strongly with male or female. Men for centuries have evolved to defend in tribal warfare, right? That's, boys do it. I mean, when you have a family like ours, watching years gone by now, the generation that's now producing their own children, but when they were young, having them all at the farm, the little boys and the little girls played in distinctively different ways. The little boys like games with hard, fast rules, and the object is to get the other guy out, and then you could laugh at him. And next time you'd get out and he'd laugh at you. They'd end up having a tumble, but really no bad feelings. I mean, they have been friends for life. Now, the girls are not quite the same. They don't do it that way. They can be quite nasty to one another. And they're quite honest about it, yeah. They exclude one of the group if they happen to be in that kind of mood. You're not friends. The boys didn't do that in the same way. We have very different ways of behaving. And in management, that matters. And you talk to the people who are vulnerable in that setting. I mean, guys are just, they're not talking as much as they used to. The most amazing thing about medical school is how much fun we had before this all came along. There were a lot of laughter, but many of the jokes were risque and a bit rude. But nobody took them seriously. Nowadays, the guys in particular walk on eggshells, especially if they've got a few vitriolic and militant compatriots to deal with. And, of course, the people who lose most are those women who got to the top because they were good. And they were very good because it was hard. Now we have people in positions like Claudine Gay, who should never have been made president of Harvard at all because she didn't even write her own PhD. She plagiarized it. But because she was black and a woman, she got the job. Fortunately, it was so egregiously bad, she was removed. But as far as I know, she still has a huge salary from Harvard, although she's not worthy of it. That's where we're at the moment. And we can't expect to improve education or anywhere, any aspect of life, if we don't make space for people who are really good to go ahead. I mean, I love the opening of the film about Turing, where he's being interviewed by a stuffy naval guy who's running the whole thing, and it's hilariously funny. And he says, well, this is the shortest interview I've had, but then he argues back by saying I'm very good at games. And in the end, the guy at least is smart enough to say, well, we'll let you see what you do and what damage you cause, because, of course, Turing was a very odd man, but he did solve that problem, and that was important. It was a major factor in winning the Second World War. So when you get to Helen Andrews, she'll take you through the story of Larry Summers, who was fired from Harvard for his behavior in terms of the male-female thing. You know, he courted it. He was not a sensitive man, shall we say. But the one that really got him over was when he gave a talk and said, well, women are not as good at spatial geometry as men. If we're going to get more women in there, how are we going to do that? And one of the women was so offended by it, she said, I could hardly breathe. And she set out to get him fired, and he was eventually fired. Now, if he'd said, which would have been justice, the statement he made was true, but it would have been equally true to say, we have difficulty in reaching the male gender quota in languages, because women are better at languages than men. You can say that, and everybody says, well, of course they are. But the math is actually slightly better in terms of the data showing that it's true. We've got to get rid of that nonsense. She said we've just got to focus on fairness. Is this way of doing things fair? If it's not fair, we need fairness. Now, if there are groups that are left out, we have to find out why. Now, it's very clear that for the black community in the States, just go and listen to Denzel Washington talking about Tom Sowell or Morgan Freeman, all black, so they can say it. They would all agree that the problem in the black community is absentee fathers, which was introduced by a bit of cynical politics many years ago, where a woman who was pregnant without a husband got a pension, and a woman who was pregnant with a husband didn't. Now, that's going to lead to absentee fathers. They didn't marry because that would take the pension away, but the men need to have a sense of responsibility, and they were persuaded not to be responsible. That's the result we've got. Everybody in the area knows that. Fortunately, black people are pushing back and saying, we don't need patronage, we need to deal with bad law and fix it. Title IX is another one that comes in that category. So we need to add a lot more debate in education. We need debate and discussion in the church much more. We're not what one might call an intellectual fervor, are we? I mean, it's hard. Even men can't manage to read a book that they actually would be interested in. Our reading has gone through the floor. I mean, coming out of high school, less than 40% of Americans are competent readers. That's a disaster. Even to use your computer at some level, if you're going to use it in a sophisticated way, you've got to do some reading as well. This is where we're at. So what do we do? Well, the first thing is we better start in our own homes and our own churches. There is a hunger out there, and we mustn't allow the people who don't want to do it to say, well, it's not important. It is important. So we need to do a lot more. God gave the 10 Commandments, and he said, the way you're going to make this work so that you flourish is you're going to teach your children history, the history of what you've done. That's astonishing. Now, I haven't got round to Dallas Willard at all, and I'm well up on time. So Dallas Willard will have to come next time, but worth listening to his talk, Faith and Rationality. from Socrates in the City. Hopefully see you next week and do a bit more about how we might help one another read more effectively. I would love to know how many of you have read The Abolition of Man, which I think is Lewis's best book and is also only 119 pages long, and cannot remember anything about it. If you could be honest enough to simply drop a line saying what that's like for you, johnsallypatrick@gmail.com. Abolition of Man. Have you read it? Yes or no? Can you remember what you read? The suggestion is that I do a little book group on Zoom that you can all then access when we've discussed it, and see if we can give you a way into that book that will be memorable. They'll be permanently available. I mean, I can quote verbatim quite a lot at the end of the first chapter because he says in a paragraph so much. So, but it would be nice to have some data. So if you are getting anything out of this podcast, because I'm getting old, at some point I should stop, let me know. Abolition of Man. Have you read it? Yes, no. If you have read it, can you remember anything? Yes, no. God bless you all.